what is the difference between quantitative and qualitative research? Well, this is my take on it. Okay. I start by saying what is quantitative, and then, everything else is qualitative. Is kind of how I approach it. Others will have different definitions. This is my take. So, first of all, what is the quantity in quantitative? I think the really important thing to understand is it's the number of cases or observations, not that you're looking at numbers, right? A lot of students will say, oh, I'm going to be quantitative because I want to look at, budget numbers, or, whatever it is they think, because the variables they're looking at are numerically measured, that, well, that makes it quantitative. That is not what makes it quantitative. What makes something quantitative is when you have a quantity of cases and observations that you're looking at, and you have data. Data is defined as variables that are consistently measured or coded across cases. So when you define a variable, some aspect of the case or observation, whatever you're studying, your subject is, when you consistently measure them, then you get data, right? Or you consistently code them. So when Paul Deal was trying to understand whether arms races start wars, whether there's a relationship between arms races and wars, he had to look at cases of nations interacting, and he looked at a lot of them because he looked at random dyads of nations. And in each case, he measured, quote unquote, or we would say more like coded, he said, hey, is there a mutual buildup between these nations? Has there been a mutual military buildup between these nations? And that was arms race, yes or no. And then, did this interaction in this year, was there a war? War, yes or no? That's coding, right? And by consistently doing that for all these dyads, these pairs of nations, that's what made it quantitative. However, there were no numbers involved. There was, other than a 0 and 1, yes or no, but that made it quantitative. So, important safety tip: you know, we have to have a large number of cases, and we have to be able to define variables and consistently measure them across cases to have data and to have, therefore, quantitative analysis. Now, when it comes to qualitative, well, when we don't do that, it's qualitative. And so, what might drive us this way? Maybe you're making observations, and, with qualitative cases, basically we're talking about case studies. But very often you don't necessarily have data, right? And so you might have facts or observations, and maybe your observations have to be contextual, right? You can't measure something consistently across, come up with a coding or a categorization across cases, right? So maybe you have contextual observations for things that need to be observed contextually. Maybe your variables are complex or ill-defined at this point in the development of the study of this phenomena in the literature, right? And one thing that comes to mind here, if we were looking at sanctioning, right, we could look at sanctions on Russia, and we could look at sanctions in general in the world, and say, hey, after sanctions go into effect, what's the costs to the country, right? So maybe cost, we could say, let's look at how GDP changed after sanctioning, or let's look at changes in GDP, right? And we could do that across all cases. However, it might be that in looking at it, we're interested in something more complex. For instance, selectorate theory says that for dictators or authoritarian leaders, controlling the flow of revenue is more important than the amount of revenue in the country. That if they control the flow of revenue within a country, that keeps them in power. So if you're trying to say, hey, is Putin hurting as a result of this? Well, how do we measure the control over the flows of revenue? That's fairly complex. I don't know that we could consistently measure that across. Now, we might be able to develop a measure of it over time. But at this point, it might be something that is too complex or not well enough defined that we can't do it. And we have to look within the case and say, hey, this is what's happening. And here, make observations about how the control of revenue changes as a result of sanctioning, right? So that would be a case for that. Also, if you want to look within a case, right? If you want to say, hey, let's look at how sanctions affected Russia, right? Well, now we're looking within, and maybe we're interested in the processes, maybe we're interested in more complex causal mechanisms, but anytime you want to do within case analysis, right? Quantitative is multiple cases. So within case analysis is usually something that's in the realm of qualitative. In the end, what you have to do is look at your research question and say, you know, one, can I do quantitative? Right? Are the variables something that are understood and defined well enough conceptually that we can measure or code them across cases consistently? Can we define the cases and identify them well? Can we do this? The other thing is, are you interested in across case, right? Or are you interested in within case? Are you interested in more contextual observations? Those are questions that'll drive you either to quantitative or qualitative research designs.